Welcome to the Plutarch Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Cox from Grammaticus.co. In this 8th episode, we'll explore the life of Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, whose foundation involved all kinds of things we would never want to be involved in, like stealing your wife, killing your brother, and constant bloody wars with your neighbors. And yet, he is a pretty fitting parallel for Theseus. And so we'll see at the roots of Athens and Rome just how much they have in common. And this is an important thing to emphasize because Plutarch's project, the way he is originally doing it for his original audience, is to show the Romans that they have more in common with the Greeks than they think. And so all of these initial parallels between Athens and Rome and their founders are going to be important to unpack as we go through. So the Romulus-Theseus parallel is a powerful one for sure. Theseus obviously didn't get to name the city after himself. There's a lot of ink spilled at the beginning of this life trying to trace the name of Rome. And it's funny because most of the tracings that Plutarch can come up with don't go back to Romulus's name. The idea is the Romans still connect themselves, though, to the major Greek stories, and Plutarch puts down all of his cards and lays down all of his chips on this fact. He really wants the Romans to have Greek roots somewhere back there. So a lot of his etymologies will get back to Greek words. That'll be a cool factor, especially in this life. And the Romans themselves are eventually cool tracing themselves back because they realize that the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, all of Mesopotamia, are way older cultures and civilizations than they will ever hope to be. And founding your entire civilization in 753 BC, you are a new kid on the block. Okay, even if 753 BC really was when you were founded. So you need to go all the way back and reach back through to the Dark Ages, really past the Dark Ages all the way to the Bronze Age if you're going to be legit. And so, of course, the Romans are legit. So who do they say their ancestor is? Well, they pick somebody in the Iliad who is saved by Poseidon specifically because Poseidon tells us that he's fated to survive the Trojan War. So they pick Aeneas, Hector's cousin and a descendant of Priam, who, as we all know in the Aeneid, right, Virgil picks this up and really runs with this idea and really fleshes out the myth as it's handed down to the rest of the West. Plutarch, living after Virgil, of course, has all of the Aeneid at hand. Aeneas, though, does not found the city of Rome. He founds the city of Alba Longa. He gets all the way to central Italy, and he begins solidifying the power for the Trojans, who interbreed with the Latins and will eventually become the Romans. So we go down several generations, and we end up with Numitor, a descendant of Romulus, who's ruling in Alba Longa, and his brother Amulius. There's a great story where you're always going to have this tension when you have brothers. It's one of the problems with monarchy. Who is the king? Okay, sure, you could say the eldest brother, but what if the younger brother feels more talented or is more choleric or just has more skills? He's going to try to demand that he should be the ruler. So Numitor and Amulius make a deal where Numitor says, all right, I'll keep the power and the land, and you can take all of the money that we still have handed down from what we were able to take away from Troy. Well, this works out terribly because Amulius buys the money to take the power, and Amulius kicks Numitor out of being king. He doesn't kill him, though, which is clutch, because Romulus and Remus are born to Numitor's daughter. There's a lot of backstory there that I'm not going to get into, but they're born to Numitor's daughter, and Amulius is afraid of these descendants, these twins who are born when Numitor's daughter is in jail, and so he demands that they be left to die by a river. The rest of the story, as they say, is fairly obvious. You know, we know that they are nursed by a wolf. A shepherd named Faustulus finds them. Fun fact, the wolf is always remembered. The woodpecker is never remembered. Plutarch mentions a woodpecker twice as also bringing food to the twin boys as they're on the river. I don't know of any famous statues with a woodpecker in them. Just saying. Faustulus, the shepherd who adopts them, realizes very quickly, though, that these boys are probably born to rule rather than obey. So the same tension that we saw in the Numitor Amulius generation is going to be repeated in the Romulus and Remus generation and pretty much just as badly, maybe worse. So Romulus and Remus grow up. They figure out that they are the grandsons of Numitor. And when they figure out their real identity, they're twins. So they're sort of bilocating. They're in two locations at once. Remus is talking to Numitor and sort of revealing who he is. And Romulus is coming up with an army that he's gathered to, help his brother to reinforce their system. And with those two sort of fighting from within and from without, they're able to overthrow Amulius's power and set Numitor back on the throne. So rather than just waiting for Numitor to die and inherit a kingdom, they actually decide to leave Alba Longa because they want to found a new city. And they're going to found it near where they were left, near the banks of the river Tiber. And they really, in this, are a lot like Theseus in that they found a city for runaways as runaways, right? First, they were orphans by chance, and then they become runaways by choice. So as runaways by choice, they now need to decide on the most important thing when you're founding a city: location, location, location. They really decide on the same little bend in the Tiber River, but Romulus goes up to the top of a hill that will later be called the Palatine, and Remus goes to the top of a hill that will later be called the Aventine. There's a problem because they're going to look to the sky to read the signs of the birds to see the will of the gods. This is a common thing in both Greek and Roman religion. We'll talk a little bit more about it later when we get to the life of Numa. But they look to the sky, and Remus sees first 6 vultures and sees that as approval from the gods. And as he runs up to go tell Romulus that he just saw 6 vultures, Romulus sees 12 vultures, and now they have a fight on their hands. Is it really about the number of birds or who saw them first? Seeing them first seems to be the better omen, but seeing 12 instead of 6 also seems to be a better omen, and Plutarch leaves that omen up to you. And then the very next thing we see is that they both start to build their walls, and Remus comes over and makes fun of Romulus's wall, jumping over it, saying, "Oh, look, I invaded your city." And there's disagreement about this, but either Romulus or a close friend of his strike Remus dead. Boom, fratricide. There it is, right at the center of your city. Literally the physical center and the foundational practices of your city. So it's really weird to have a city founded on fratricide, but there it is. That's Rome. Romulus, shortly thereafter, selects the center and plows the circumference of Rome. That's going to make this sacred barrier called the Pomerium. Plutarch gives several etymologies for the Pomerium, maybe from poma, the Latin for first fruits. And once he has completed the Pomerium, it's important that he lifts the plow everywhere that there's a gate. So gates are still allowed to have profane things cross them, but everything else will define what are the laws that apply inside the urbs, inside the city, and what are the laws that apply outside of the city. And a lot of Roman customs will grow up around what's allowed inside and what is not allowed inside the city. One common example from Greek history is that you, in general, in a polis, you don't bury your dead inside the city. So when does all this happen? Well, this is one of the most important dates in Roman history. So if you're going to memorize, there's probably 3 or 4 important dates to memorize before Christ in terms of Roman history, and this is the number one, April 21st, 753 BC. April 21st, 753 BC is Rome's birthday. So Plutarch then kind of goes on a tangent here about modern astronomy and how they figured out the birthday of Rome, the exact date of Romulus's birth, a bunch of other things. And then he decides to start talking about all these foundational issues. So the foundations themselves are, he's looking back all the way to the roots of the words themselves. And we get etymologies that are also etiologies. So what is that word? Well, the etymology is the etymos. It's the belief that when we look at the roots of a word or how a word was originally used or even how a word was used over time, we're getting closer to the etymos, to the essence of what that word describes or what that word points to. And an etiology is the ways that we make sense of the why of something. So an example would be, why you could ask, why do we have 50 stars on the American flag right now? And the idea is, well, the very first flag that was designed had 1 star for each colony. So as we've added states, of course, we are up to 50 now. We don't have any representing the territories. So these are the etymologies and the etiologies that he's going to bind together. So we get a distinction between the legion and the populus. The populus is everybody. That's the people that live inside of Rome. But the legion comes from the Latin word lego legere, to select, And those are the men selected out for military service for the city of Rome. So Rome is a city-state, and her legions are her selected men to serve for her. We also get the word patricians. There's a lot of great etymologies, but the most common one is that because Romulus has founded a city for refugees, many of the men don't know where they came from. They don't know who their fathers are. And so perhaps the patricians, the early patricians, are those that are from the stable family structures that have actually moved to Rome and can prove their parentage. It's more likely that they just were the already leading people of the city, and they came to be called the patres, or the fathers of the city. And over time, just like we call our founders the founding fathers, although we do that under the influence of Rome, the patres in this life, or the patricians, are going to be an exact equivalent to senators. So they are the men, the leading men of the city. And actually, at that point, he turns and gives us the etymology of senate as well, where senate comes from the Latin word senex, which means old man. And so the elders, the people that you would normally rely on for advice and perspective, are the original 100 that Romulus selects for the Senate. And then on top of that, we have the social glue of Rome, which is that we don't just have patres or patricians, but we actually have patrons. And patrons are there to look out for their clients as the advisors and supporters, those beneath them. We can talk more about patronage as we get further and further into the Republic, because this becomes a very important idea for a lot of social customs that have the force of law amongst the Romans. But I'll just give one example right now. A patron and client had a similar immunity to a husband and wife in that they would never be required by law to testify against each other in court. So they had that privilege. They had the ability to say, well, I'm going to recuse myself from testifying against my client. And then we get to probably Romulus's most famous episode, permanently immortalized in a hilarious fashion by Sabine women in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and sometimes classically called the rape of the Sabines. Probably rape in both senses, unfortunately. So again, I warned you in the Theseus life, these are not very clean, child-friendly lives for reading out loud. But in the seizure of the Sabines, as I will call it, oh no, that doesn't work. Seizure doesn't work on so many levels. Let's call it stealing of the Sabine women. There we go. Plutarch asks the question, does he need women or want war? And that's a tough one to distinguish early on in Rome's history, because they seem to be so bellicose, so belligerent, that it's hard to decide what they're doing for the sake of war and what they're doing for the sake of women. But Plutarch comes down on the side that, look, they needed the women. And this is an interesting point that I always make to my students. Let's say you go and you found a city and you open it up to whoever wants to come. What kinds of people do you usually get? You're going to get people who are no longer welcome in their former political establishment. You're going to get people who are good at traveling alone over long distances. And so you're going to get men between the ages of 17 and 35 who are probably unmarried, because moving a family is that much harder. And so, at least initially, your first wave of immigration, if you open it up to whoever wants to get there, is you're going to end up with the strongest contingent of the population getting there. And the kind that has the least to lose, because everything behind them, they are happy to leave at the first opportunity. So I agree that Plutarch's logic is pretty sound, and it seems like he needs women because all he has is criminals, brigands, and other men of the lower order who have burned their bridges, so to speak, in their previous places. So Romulus finds an altar and sets up a feast and invites all of the neighboring tribes to the feast. This seems like it would be grave sacrilege to treat the gods this way, to use the gods as a pretext for stealing your wives, but strangely, it never seems to redound back against him, even though other things do make the gods angry in this life. But anyway, he gives a signal, he stands up, does something with his toga. The Roman men jump up, steal their women, and now the rest, as they say, is history. He tells a bunch of hilarious stories that are related to this, and the very first one is that he's not sure how many exactly were stolen. He does know that it's either 30, 527, or 683. Which is just great. So a couple traditions that we have all the way down to even our memory to this day are the tradition of carrying a woman across the threshold is a tradition going back to the stealing of the Sabine women because they're coming in not of their own volition, right? The woman isn't crossing the threshold. So it's a lot of intense stuff to get here. And obviously the Sabines immediately attack, and we get this, there's almost like two waves of a response. There's the initial response, and that's where Romulus challenges somebody to a 1-versus-1, a one-on-one, a guy named Acron, wins and dedicates his armor to Jupiter and sort of invents the Roman triumph, which we'll talk about in other lives like Camillus or Marius. So the Roman triumph, where you crown yourself with laurels, you march your spoils through the city, and you sing all kinds of songs, and then you dedicate your spoils to the gods, sometimes even dedicating some of the captured people in the war to the gods, although Romulus doesn't do that. And then, just like in the life of Theseus, where we had seen these battles which take place in the city of Rome, or for Theseus, in the city of Athens, and you get to look around your neighborhood and think, oh yeah, that hill that I cross on my way to school, or thing that I see every time I go into the marketplace, that's where that happened, that historic thing happened, right? And we get 3 of these places right here from this first battle. We get the Tarpeian Rock, which Plutarch places here in history, even though other historians will place it elsewhere. But essentially on the Capitoline, there's a steep cliff face that you'll still see. People will still point it out to you to this day. It's pretty clear that if you threw somebody from that height, it's steep enough and a big enough fall that they would fall to their death. So Tarpeia is the daughter of one of the Romans, and she turns traitor and allows the Sabines up onto the Capitoline, the fortified hill of Rome itself. Plutarch uses this to examine treachery, but ultimately we need to know that her name becomes the name for that rock because of her betrayal there. So she is attracted to the gold that the men wear on their arms, and she says in exchange for the gold bands and the shiny things that they're wearing, she'll let them onto the Capitoline. And as each soldier passes her, they throw their shield and the gold that they have with them on her, and she's essentially killed by what she wanted buried in their shields and gold bracelets. So Plutarch has a number of thoughts on treachery there, but the idea is she gets both what she asked for and what she deserves at the same moment. And so the Tarpeian Rock becomes this image of justice in getting what you deserve. So a lot of murderers, particularly heinous murderers, will be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. That becomes the image of justice for us. The second place that's named out of 3 is the Lacus Curtius, or the Lacus Curtius, where the Tiber floods and this Sabine kid is riding his horse and leading the charge into battle, but he gets stuck in the mud. Rather than have everybody charging in behind him, he's smart enough to jump off his horse, warn them, and, pick a different route. And so ever afterwards, that place is named after him. It's really hard for us to see this when we go to modern Rome, because Rome has built those giant flood control walls along the Tiber. I think they were built under Mussolini. So the Tiber River is so far down that you don't ever think about it being a river that can flood. I mean, even you can think of Paris or London, where the river's a little bit closer to the level of the city, but I'm trying to think of a river where maybe the Chicago River that flows through Chicago, where you're not like standing really high and looking down on it. It seems to be almost at the level of the city itself. That's really where the Tiber was at this point. And then the last place that we learn is that this temple is named Jupiter Stator, and Stator means the stander, or the guy who could not be moved. And that's where Romulus turns to resist, but it's also where the women come out and intervene, and we have all these famous paintings throughout history. I'll link to some in the show notes, where the Sabine women have now been for so long in the Roman control that now they have to choose between their husbands and their fathers and brothers. And, they bring out the babies, and this whole idea is that the Sabines and the Romans are going to need to learn to live. So that is where the Comitium, which are the different political groups that vote in Rome, that is where Plutarch gives us the etymology of that. That's a co-ire, a coming together. It's that place, that temple of Jupiter Stator, the establisher, where the peace is established and the Sabines and the Romans decide to become one person. So Romulus is going to have a co-ruler who's a Sabine. Romulus will rule, and the Romans and the Sabines, but I guess also King Tatius, or Tatius, will rule the Sabines and the Romans. So you have a two-king system for a while, and you break them down into 3 tribes. We add 100 more senators, so now we have 200 senators. 100 of them are Roman, and 100 of them are Sabine. And now we start to get into something that also feels very Thesean from when we read Theseus's life. We've got to combine the feasts. We got to old and new, right? So the Matronalia becomes a feast that remembers the Sabine women who were the mothers of the new Roman generation. And so it celebrates motherhood. It's, a sacred Mother's Day. He mentions the Carmentalia, the Polilia. The Vestals are first mentioned here, even though Plutarch admits they may have been invented by Numa, and we'll get to him. And the most important feast, at least from an English speaker's perspective, is probably the Lupercalia, because that is the feast for fertility, and it sort of harkens back to the stealing of the Sabine women as well. Young men run around the city with these little whips, and they whip women in hopes of increasing their fertility in the springtime. But it's important to us for several reasons. One is the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar is set in the Lupercalia. It starts actually in the Feast of Lupercalia, so February, about a month before Caesar dies. So Shakespeare compresses a lot of the timeline, but obviously he has to for a 5-act play. And Mark Antony is one of the young men running around, right? And Caesar asks that his wife Calpurnia be, hit so that Caesar will have an heir. And so we immediately see that one of the things Caesar has not yet accomplished at the beginning of Julius Caesar play is an heir. And so this man who has done so much and achieved so much still lacks somebody to hand it on to. We also see that the Lupercalia is where we have these days, or these ways of talking about days in Rome, where there are days where it is permissible to have a feast and days where it is not permissible to have a feast. And so the days where it is not permissible are called the ne fasti, right? And the days that are permissible are called the fasti. And that's interesting to English speakers because we get the word nefarious as a particular kind of evil that is maybe unspeakably evil, unmentionable almost, right? So that's just a fun little etymology of nefarious. And then finally we get a little bit of origin of bird watching. We get the laws on divorce and murder. Plutarch has some strong opinions about the unfairness of the laws on divorce. This is not the only life where he goes into the laws on divorce. So clearly he saw rules about marriage and family as being some of the most important laws that a polis or city will come up with. He also mentions that murder of the father, so remember we're in a city where it was founded on murder of the brother, but murder of the father is not committed for 600 years. Pretty bold claim. So where do we go from there? Well, this is kind of the place in the life where things take a turn for the worse. And we get Tatius, or Tatius, Romulus's co-king, is killed by a conspiracy of people that don't like him, but not really directly related to Romulus. But Romulus doesn't avenge the death. This the gods disapprove of. Not when Romulus killed his brother, but when his co-king dies and he looks the other way, then the gods send plague and bloody rain, which is a lot like the plague that they sent during or before Theseus's life, which the Athenians had to stave off by sending 14 of their children to the Minotaur. So this plague and bloody rain happens, and finally Romulus rights the wrong. So the murderers of Tatius end up being killed themselves. And Romulus initially thinks, all right, well, murder for murder. Everybody got what they deserved. But most of the Romans don't accept that, and the rain of blood comes and the plague comes. And so Romulus knows that the gods are displeased, and then he punishes both sets of murderers, so all the accomplices and the other people, because obviously 2 people are dead. And then he buries Tatius on the Aventine with honor. So we then get a couple other odd things that happen that just make it seem like the sources maybe are thin on the end of Romulus's life. Romulus fights his last battle with their neighbors. They were apparently constantly at war with their neighbors, so this is really just worth mentioning only because it's the last one, and because it has this legendary number where Romulus supposedly killed 7,000 men single-handedly in a single day. Plutarch himself calls this a fable. I'm not really sure who could believe a stat like that. But it's at this moment that Romulus becomes a haughty king, so it's very similar to Theseus's sudden turn on his return from prison. Romulus, after this battle, stops fighting for the Romans. He wears purple, he reclines on a couch, he has these lictors follow in front of him, and he basically acts like a haughty tyrant. So all these kings end badly, and again, monarchy, while it can be good for Plutarch, it's not something that tends to stay good for very long, so there's another political warning for us. He also has a cool etymology of lictors, and I think in the life of Cicero, I think I may have mentioned that Catiline was using lictors outside of the city, but the lictors are basically these guys who carry the rods and the axes, which are the symbols of Roman authority. So the rods are the symbols that they can beat you or force you, right, to do what the law says, and the axe is the symbol of capital punishment. But then the fact that all of the rods are bound together with the axe at their center mean that really the polis, or the res publica, as Rome's republic will eventually be called, is by combining the power of everybody together that they remain strong. So the Roman explanation and the standard Roman etymology for those fasces, as they're called, is this binding together from the verb ligo, ligare. We get words like ligament from it, right? So what I think is cool is that Plutarch has a false etymology that puts a gloss on it where it's so clear and so cool what he's trying to teach the Romans. His Greek explanation is that it's closely related to the word liturgy, leiturgos, which really means work of the people or work for the people, or in this case, the worker for the people. And so the lictor's job is to represent this person, the consul, or the king, or the senator, that he's walking in front of and holding the symbols of power of, works for the people, does his ergon, right, for the laos or the leitos. And that is almost certainly a completely false etymology, but man, is it a creative way for Plutarch to weave a lesson in there for the Romans. And for us, we use terms all the time like public servant and public service. But I wonder how often we still think about that instead of thinking about the school board member who's using it as a stepping stone to be a city councilman, who's using it as a stepping stone to run for state office, who's using it as a stepping stone to work at the federal level. And maybe just because I'm close to DC, I'm jaded and I think that and see that all around me. But it would be nice to remember that all the way down to the most local level of politics, they are public servants. And I think there's an element where Plutarch's own life comes into play here. Plutarch very, very easily could have, if he wanted to, left his small town of Chaeronea and lived in a place like Athens, or a place even more important like Rome, and probably done all kinds of service for the empire. But he really sees the local service that he does as a priest in Delphi and as a governor in Greece as helping exactly where he needs to help, as being a public offering to the people of his work. And, finally the lives could be seen that way as well, right? An offering to all peoples about what it means to work for the public good. So Romulus is really close to the end here. His grandfather dies, Numitor, very long-lived, must be, dies in Alba, and so Romulus is now the king of Alba Longa, or Alba as the region is sometimes called. The goal for Plutarch, for the Republic, and he knew this and knew that Romulus was setting out for this, was that all might be subject and rulers in turn. But the idea is that that's the goal of a republic, is that people are learning and practicing all the time, both ruling and being ruled. And so we lose that as Romulus nears the end of his life, ceases his wars, increases his kingdom through inheritance, and then ceases to even treat the Senate as an advisory body anymore. Doesn't even lean on them for advice. it seems that he gathers them together and tells them what's going to happen, so that the only advantage they have, as Plutarch says it, is that they know first, and then he tells everybody else. But then there's this really weird thing that happens at the end of Romulus's life that Plutarch really struggles with. The fact is, Romulus disappears. He does not seem to die. He does not seem to die in any clear sense. So he was either, according to Plutarch, there's only two other options. He was either murdered or he was taken up into heaven. The story, as it will develop later, especially in the life of Numa and by later authors, is that he was taken up into heaven. So now we have a way that where Rome is named after a god. And we have, in our end is our beginning, right? He introduced us with this complicated conversation about, like, where does Rome get its name? And then he ends on this note of, well, it could get its name from a god or a hero being worshipped as a god. But man, does he have a lot of struggle with that. But there's a man who's coming on his way into Rome, and he has a vision of Romulus after Romulus has disappeared. And I just find that this quote of advice to the Romans so worth telling and dwelling on because of what it says and what it doesn't say. So Romulus's advice in this dream vision to this guy coming into the city is, tell the Romans that by the exercise of temperance and fortitude, they shall attain the height of human power. My own personal take on this is that temperance and fortitude are the lower two virtues when you stack up prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Prudence is the mother and mold of all the virtues that tells him when to act and how to act, right? Justice is immediately underneath that, giving everyone his due and being aware of what is due to each. And then fortitude and temperance are often very personal virtues that, frankly, you get a lot of practical benefits from that don't always come from prudence and justice. So the number of practical benefits that come from being able to control yourself or do something you don't want to do, that redounds most of the time to your benefit. So I just find it interesting that the Romans are given the advice by Romulus that of the four virtues that the philosophers are just going to hammer home in the Greco-Roman tradition, right? Prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, only the lower two are really emphasized. And so as we read through the other Roman lives, I think we're going to see a lot of examples of temperance and fortitude. And I wonder if Plutarch is maybe warning us that we might not see as many examples of justice or of prudence as we would like. So the last thing is that Plutarch is really skeptical of the poet's stories. And yet, here at the end, he quotes a poet in his favor because what he cannot believe is that the body lives on after the soul. The philosophers of Plato and Aristotle's ilk really saw the body and matter as something less good than the intellect and the immaterial. And so that which passes away is not as good as the permanent and eternal soul that we've been given. And so he quotes, this is my English rhymey translation, all human bodies yield to death's decree. The soul survives until eternity. For the soul alone derives from the gods, is his argument. And so he really struggles with that idea of, we can see how he would differ very strongly from people writing in his own time, like Luke, St. John, who said exactly that, right? This guy who probably was God, took flesh, and then rose from the dead. So that's number one, weird. And two, then took that flesh all the way with him back up to heaven, because the body and the soul will now live forever, right, in this new thing. So I feel like Plutarch gives us a really cool contrast with what the gospel ends up, or the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, end up strongly asserting, and without blinking an eye. Plutarch really struggles. He would be right there with you, for the soul is eternal and cannot die. But he really struggles with the idea that Romulus could have had his body taken up to heaven as well. That's just not an appropriate thing. It's illogical to this particular philosopher. So that about wraps it for this episode. Again, I want to thank you guys for listening to the podcast, for the download, for sharing it. Ask you to share plutarch.life with whoever you know who's a teacher or is interested in Plutarch, or just the ways biography makes us think about our own lives. Biography makes us reflect on our own political and personal and moral choices. If you can, keep leaving reviews or ratings on the podcast in iTunes, but it's probably more important that you share it at this point with your friends. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you have any questions or are struggling through reading something or would really like a resource like a map or a particular question answered, you can contact me at tom@grammaticus.co. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope I've inspired you to open Plutarch and let his lives affect yours.